Chapter 201 Demonic Essence. Do you need anything? Are you hungry? Do you want me to make you anything? How's that? Are you comfortable? The stream of questions was never-ending, and while her concern was endearing, it bordered on annoying. No, Mom. I don't need anything. I'm not hungry, and yes, I'm comfortable. I droned for the 100th time since waking up. For the past 2 days, she'd been fussing over me like I was a newborn baby again. I tried to bear with it to make her feel better, but I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. Thankfully, a distraction was about to take place that would make her cool her jets. It wasn't like she could continue her tirade of questions while we were meeting about things, right? Injured as I was, it was difficult to get a sense of things happening outside my tent. I spent most of my time lying down in cold meditation, trying to recover as best I could, which didn't leave a lot of time to walk among the people and get an idea of how everyone was doing. I knew we lost a lot during the battle. I had the numbers already, but I wanted to feel it rather than hear about it. While a fight with the other city over the mine wasn't likely, it wasn't out of the picture, which meant I had to spend my day trying to get as fighting fit as possible instead of walking around the camp. Doing that involved a lot of ice, a healing rune, Ashley's continued help, and a liberal but constant use of cold meditation. The self-healing skill was great for the small stuff, but being as injured as I was highlighted the limitations of the skill. It didn't work at all towards regrowing my arm, and its efficiency at healing bigger things was abysmal. An actual healer was the fastest way to get back together, as crazy as that sounded. My natural vitality helped, along with the ice-cold chill pumping through my veins, but the state I was in wouldn't be fixed naturally anytime soon. I still wasn't sure how or why there was a chill pumping through me, but I wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. Over half our council was back in Frostheim, but the couple that were here started to trickle into my tent. Besides my mother, Hal was the only other one here. To make up for that, Gabriel and Rachel joined inside the tent. The rest of the council stayed behind. Abigail and Jonathan for obvious reasons. Sam didn't wish to come, and Vincent wasn't a fighter. The last member was Austin, but his absence was accounted for. I had offered Ashley the chance to sit in for her missing mother, but she was busy with the other wounded. I wasn't her only patient, and she needed to check up on the rest. It was half the usual size, but it would have to do. My tent wasn't spacious, but it was big enough that it could fit the 4 additional people. Hal and Rachel stood together near the opening while Gabriel and my mother were at my bedside. "Well, tell me the thick of it," I asked. "Tension with the other city is still heightened, but going down. With your appearance, I don't think they will fight us over the mine," Rachel said. It was good news, but there was more she was leaving out. "But," she paused for a moment, "there have been some developments while cleaning up the battlefield. If my ribs didn't hurt so much, I would have laughed. Other than uncovering a massive crystal mine," I chuckled. "While everyone here are mostly fighters, there are some that have advanced their profession as well." She started, "Specifically, the alchemists are the ones who discovered it. The bodies of the demons can be refined for various materials, and one in particular is a problem." After an expectant look and a dramatic pause, she answered the unspoken question. "They distilled them down into demonic essence," she said. The breath left me after waiting for the answer. It wasn't as bad as I thought. The way she said it was a problem made me think they were trying to resummon them or something. Reanimate them, maybe? Both were the worst options, and I expected her to say something on that scale. I didn't know where my mind went, but it heard problem and thought the worst. All told, demonic essence wasn't that bad. It was frowned upon and distasteful, but not the end of the world. "I don't understand, what's the problem with that? We can't use the bodies anyways. Why is turning them into demonic essence bad?" Gabriel asked. It was easy to forget he hadn't spent months with us during the tutorial. Abigail was an information freak and tried to get her hands on every scrap of it made available to us, which was why we knew while he didn't. I turned to him. "It isn't strictly bad, but it can be used for distasteful things." With that answered, I turned to Rachel. "What do they plan on using it for?" When asked, all but one said experimentation. "And the other?" In his words, "to make vampires." I was afraid of that. Demonic essence was one of the key ingredients involved with any demonic bloodline. While having a demonic bloodline wasn't bad per se, it was generally looked down on. There was a stigma tied to it that dragged it down. A stereotype. While not all who chose demonic bloodlines were evil, there were those who chose it for that specific reason. It was a case of a few people ruining it for the rest. I myself didn't feel strongly one way or the other. It didn't much matter to me what kind of bloodline people chose for themselves, but some demonic bloodlines were inherently bad. Angelic and demonic were pushing the boundaries for equal and opposite reasons. Both bloodlines influenced the bloodline holder more than any other. While animalistic bloodlines would influence a person to walk differently or do things more stealthy if it was in the bloodline's nature, it wasn't strong in its influence. It was easily dealt with and conditioned out of a person. It could get bad if the person pushed the bounds, and using higher-tier materials while evolving made it worse. If the person wasn't prepared or wasn't strong enough, they wouldn't be able to handle it and turn partially feral. It was the risk of using materials above your own rank. For every reward, there was a risk. If I wasn't strong enough for the young frost giant heart I used, the same would have happened to me. The other option was the body tore itself apart trying to assimilate the high-ranking material, but that was only in cases of extreme failure and usually resulted in death. Demonic and angelic were notorious for their difficulty in mastering the influence. Specific bloodlines of the affinity would never stop trying to influence the holder, making it a constant battle that would go on until either the person succumbed or died. The last option was to remove the bloodline, but not many did that. Why imbibe it in the first place if you were going to remove it? They were also one of the only few that could completely change a person's race. I would never turn into a full-blooded frost giant, no matter how far I pushed in rank, but demon bloodlines were different. Their nature was to infiltrate and corrupt. Imbibing their bloodline would change a person the same way any bloodline would, but as you gained power and strengthened the demon properties, it would do it to your own body. The human part. Where humans would usually only be able to partially change with their chosen bloodline, a full change was possible with demonic and angelic. Informing Gabriel and my mother of all that made them see the problem the same as the rest of us. Is the alchemist ours or theirs? I asked. Theirs. That makes things harder. If the alchemist was from our city, we would be able to watch over and supervise the procedure, if not stop it completely, but that wasn't the case. We would be able to warn and advise, but if Ashton didn't do anything, we weren't in a position to force the issue. I was willing to fight over the mine because of what it represented. I wasn't willing to do so over an alchemist. We will need to watch him. I don't care if people take demonic bloodlines, but we need to watch for any that go out of control. I said. Gabriel made a face. Why not stop it now? Squash it before it even becomes a problem. I won't for a few reasons, I started. 1. It is not my city. I have no rule over what his people do. 2. Even if I did rule over them, I will not tell people which bloodlines they can and cannot imbibe. That starts down a road I do not wish to go down. And 3. Think about the larger picture. Seeing that he didn't understand my third point, I went on. If demons were summoned here, this soon after the change, how many other places do you think they've been summoned? Gabe's face made me know he caught on. Stopping the demonic bloodlines here is just a patch for the larger problem. They will get out, if not here then elsewhere. I continued. Gabriel wasn't convinced. Even if we can't stop the wider world from doing it, we can at least stop it from happening so close to home. What's the point? I said. Banning it for the off chance that some might go wild? That reasoning could be used to ban a lot of things, not all of which are good. So you won't do it because you don't like the precedent it sets? He asked incredulously. No, I won't do it because I don't want to become a dictator, I said firmly. Even if it's for their own good? He asked. Especially if it's for their own good, I answered. A note of silence held for a few beats while everyone processed what was said. Does anyone have anything more to say on the matter? I asked. When no one answered, I said one more thing to finish it. Make sure to get some for Connor. I don't know what he'll do with it, but I'd rather have it than not. With that, we moved on to the next order of business. There have been some who have disregarded your order to not touch the mine. Rachel said, They sneak out at night to steal what they can without getting caught. I ordered a watch over the mine for this specific reason. I knew with the amount of wealth the mine held, some would try their luck. What do you want to do about them? Hal asked. He was the one watching most of the time and knew who the culprits were. Any from our side? I asked. Yes, but the majority are from Fort Hope. I sighed. I had thought people under my command knew me better by now. Get me a list of who. I will decide when we get back, I said. I didn't want to get into it now. Should we stop them? Hal asked. I shook my head. No, they can't be taking much if they're trying to be sneaky, and I'll use it as leverage during the negotiations. The wealth they steal will be offset by what I was already going to give them. Just mark down who did it so they can be accounted for and so we don't award them any. That was the last of that topic and the last subject was brought up. With the cleanup mostly done, we need to know what to do with the bodies, Rachel said. It was a sad subject as the bodies she was talking about weren't the demons. I will deal with it, I said. We will pack them and bring them home. It would make the trip longer, but any who fought for my city deserved a resting place inside of it. To preserve them as best as possible, I would go around encasing them. Personal touch they deserved. Anything else? I asked. The messenger arrived yesterday. Is your letter to send back ready? My mother chimed in. I had forgotten about that. With Abigail's ability to contact me restored after replacing the pylon, the messenger was sent with us during our trip as she didn't need it as much. He didn't have much combat ability and was left in Fort Hope to stay safe. With the battle over, a scout was sent to retrieve him. Yes, it's ready, I said. Hopefully she isn't too worried. Oh, who was I kidding? She was probably worried sick. Chapter 202 Moving Forward. Abigail. Point of view. Honey, you need to stop checking that. John sighed as he saw his wife checking the same screen once again. She knew he was right, but she couldn't help herself. The pylon leadership screen was her only way of knowing everything was all right. Well, not all right, but it was the only thing she could do. For weeks, she had the screen pop up whenever she had free time or the worry reared its ugly head. Every time it opened, there was a split second where she prayed with everything she had that his name was still there. I can't help it, John, she said dejectedly. He heard the despondent tone and came over and wrapped his arms around her. The sense of security in his embrace barely enough to ward off the evil thoughts her brain thought up. He's stronger than he looks. I would know. Him and that hammer could thrash me even without his more powerful skills. John said, trying to ease her mind. Abigail knew how strong her brother was, but it was a fundamental problem in her mind to worry. She knew the lengths he would go to protect everyone, the danger he would throw himself into. Still, she couldn't let it distract her from the goings-on here. It was her job to hold down the fort, and she would do it spectacularly. They were already ahead of schedule on most projects, even without the additional manpower that had left. She ran through the checklist in her mind. The farms are ahead of schedule with everything already planted and growing. The quarry caught up as the miners gained levels and the reserve of stone is growing. The construction effort is already on phase 2, waiting for the enchantments and for Chris to get back. The dungeon output is low, but that is to be expected with the fighters leaving. The 4 biggest projects were either on schedule or ahead of schedule, and she was immensely pleased at that. The workers who remained toiled tirelessly so that when everyone came home, it was perfect. Abigail wondered if that was because of her emotions bleeding into the people around her or if everyone felt the same way she did and wanted to impress with how much they got done. John broke away and started dressing for the day to come. It became her little ritual to check the screens every morning just in case something happened while she was asleep. After the warmth left, she got up to do the same. She went through the same motions ever since they moved into the castle. Chris had the forethought to make sure there were enough rooms for everyone in the family and even a few extra, just in case. Making the walk to wake her children as far as across the hall instead of up the stairs. Anna, get ready for school. She knocked and shouted through the closed door. She walked a few steps to the next door and did the same knock. Josh, get ready for school. It was nice to be able to fall back on old routines. Mornings like this were like clockwork before everything changed. except she was now doing it while living in a castle instead of their old home. The kitchen was further away as well, but she had gotten used to that change by now. After giving them the first round of wake-up calls, she began making breakfast for all of them. Her hand at open fire cooking much better than her first attempts. A much welcome change compared to before. She couldn't remember a time when Jonathan had the time to eat breakfast with them, usually out the door before the kids needed to be up and off to work. It wasn't quite bacon she was cooking, but the kids had gotten used to the odd tastes for breakfast. That had been rough to get Josh through it, as he was quite picky. John managed to hunt a deer while out training, which made for a fine breakfast. As the cooking finished up cooking, sizzling away, she went back to give them their second round of wake-up calls, much the same as the first. A chorus of grumpy "I'm ups" rang out, even though she knew that not to be true. Still, a few minutes later, 2 bobs of bedhead made their way to the table. The little things made everything easier. A meal with family, even if it went by too quickly. "All right, off to school with you," she shooed. A few grumbles were heard, but they moved in the right direction at least. Both going to grab the things they would need for the day. A few other parents had gotten together to form it, and all took turns teaching the subject they were best at. Other than some initial hurdles to get used to teaching, it was going well. It gave the kids the chance to socialize and meet others the same age. Abigail had tried to squeeze a few hours of teaching into her busy schedule before the school was built, and it didn't go very well. She was stretched too thin, which made it no good for anyone. While they were off, she turned to the other thing that had been on her mind lately, besides what her family was off fighting. A golden envelope sat on her desk. A wax seal ensured its contents were kept unopened, and it was one she hadn't seen before. A triad of mountaintops with a wall ringing the base. The wax itself wasn't a rosy red as expected, but a granite gray, matching the theme of the sigil. When the letter first arrived, she had been overjoyed, thinking it was news from her family. She was only a little disappointed to find out that it wasn't from them but another pylon entirely. Mountainside. They weren't sure where exactly this new pylon stood, but they already had a few ideas. The name itself was a large clue. Mountains were more numerous now that things had changed, but they still weren't dotted all over the place. Her first thought was Denver, but that was too far away. The letter hadn't arrived by messenger, but by some magical means. For a person's skill or formation of some kind to send a letter all the way from Denver was unlikely, especially when there were mountains closer. The other thought against it coming from Denver was the reasoning. There had to be tens of pylons closer to the big city than theirs, making it extremely unlikely they would reach out all the way to here. After speaking to some who lived up here for longer, they theorized it was from somewhere near Calgary, but they weren't sure. The where was uncertain, but she didn't know if she should open it or not. It was addressed to the pylon owner, which was Chris, but it wasn't like he would care one way or the other. "Just open it. You've been staring at it since it arrived. He won't mind," John said. He was right, he wouldn't care, but she still felt hesitant. Blowing out a breath, she grabbed the letter and began opening it. Austin. Point of view. Nearly 2 months inside the camp, and he was nowhere closer to achieving his goal than before. Even with the help of the city's warriors, and Austin using a lot more effort than he anticipated needing, the bugs continued to be a problem. They were endless. No matter how many he speared, or how many Marcus sliced in half, or Clarissa roasted, or everyone else crushed into paste, they always came back in force. The only positive to come out of his presence was the city wasn't as boxed in as before. With Austin's help, they were able to liberate one of the dungeons around the city from the insects. While only holding 1 out of 3 wasn't a lot, the fact they now had an influx of materials uplifted people's spirits. While the dungeon didn't give what they were in desperate need of, metal, giving any materials at all was better than nothing. Even if it only gave an assortment of gems and crystals. They even managed to get a skill shard out of it. It was only found on the 3rd floor and the skill was only common, but the fact it dropped one at all was surprising. The dungeons around Frostheim had only dropped a handful so far, and they had delved them for months. Chris was quite put out that he hadn't gotten one yet, even though he delved into them the most. The insects constantly attacked the dungeon trying to take the area back, but they had managed to hold onto it so far. With every passing day, they entrenched themselves that much more. making the assaulting bugs easier and easier to deal with. Austin was starting to get a little frustrated. If Chris were here, the bugs would be dead by now. It was hard not to compare his progress to what he imagined his friend would be capable of. He knew he wasn't as good as Chris, but it stung to know how far the gap was. Even the levels he gained from the near-constant fighting didn't lift his spirits. Mostly because he knew he would be stuck soon. He didn't meet the requirements to evolve. He had 2 least laws and he hadn't managed to push either to lesser. It felt like his light law was close to upgrading, but it still wasn't quite there. He also hadn't undergone the body refinement process yet. Plans bubbled in the back of his mind on what he was going to do, but it was still annoying to know the levels he gained would soon be capped. He could evolve on his own, but taking a shot in the dark with something as important as an evolution was stupid. Especially when he didn't have any golden eagle parts to improve his bloodline with. Hell, he had barely gotten a chance to strengthen it, let alone be ready for an evolution. Austin had assumed there would be so much more time before the time for D rank came, but from the constant fighting, his level would be ready way before everything else was. Taking a page out of Christopher's book, he planned to do everything he could before evolving. Pushing his laws to lesser, forming his anchor, strengthen and purify his bloodline, and refine his body. He was behind in so many ways. He didn't regret leaving. He needed to explore, yearned for it, but he hadn't realized it would net him so many levels that he would have to play catch up with everything else. He couldn't wait to be done with the infernal insects so he could start on his lengthening to-do list. Chris. Point of view. The battlefield was ruined. Everywhere I looked was either an impact site or the place a body had once laid. Crumpled and deformed demons were all that was left to populate the wasteland of craters and divots. Their taint would linger for a long while before it was cleansed. People did what they could. Even now they were out trying to destroy what they could of the demonic corruption. But it wouldn't be completed overnight. The explosion caused a large chunk of the taint to be destroyed, along with the landscape, but if demonic taint was that easy to cleanse, it wouldn't be the headache that was written about in books. My body still flared with pain as I walked, but this was something I needed to do. Being cooped up in the tent was enough to drive me mad, and some fresh air was a welcome change. Even if it wasn't the crisp air of winter and the muggy, thick air of summer. We were set to march back to Fort Hope at sunrise the following day, and this would be my last chance to walk the battlefield. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I wasn't even sure there was anything to look for, but it felt right. My mind could nearly picture it. The mage spells blasting the earth, swords and shields gleaming in the sun as they moved. Even the demonic stench had its place in my imagination. It was like I was there again, the past week rewound so I could experience it for the second time. So many thoughts came to mind, but I pushed them all away. I didn't want to spend my last day here planning for the future, even if it was a major thing I needed to do. I had been lax. I had thought the end of the tutorial would allow us to take our foot off the gas pedal, to slow down. I was wrong. Calling how I built my city slow wasn't far off from how I felt. I hadn't hired city guards, as I wanted the castle to be finished. I hadn't started a lot of things for the same reason. I hadn't even upgraded our pylon yet. My entire timeline was centered around when the challenge would come. The test we would have to face to keep the system's protection. Whether this year or the next, it would come, and I had planned around that instead of what just happened. If the demons had been closer, we wouldn't have been able to fight them alone. We didn't have enough people, we weren't strong enough, and that was a failure on my part. One I meant to rectify. I had already put things in motion to do just that. I couldn't wait to progress. I needed to constantly move forward, or surprise threats like this would end us. And that was something I couldn't allow. Chapter 203, Traveling Back. Chris. Point of view. The sun rose on yet another day, and I sat to watch it. Even the stray thought that so many weren't here to see it didn't dampen my mood. It was a fact of life that I was getting better at dealing with, sadly enough. We fought and some didn't make it. That was life. The fact none of my family were among the fallen was the only reason I could be so cavalier. If one had, I wouldn't have been sitting here watching the sunrise. I don't know what I'd be doing. After walking the battlefield, I went to all our prepared transportation to preserve the bodies. All who left Frostheim with me were to be given a rightful send-off. Their coffins glistened in the morning sun as light reflected off the pristine ice. It was something of a personal thank you from me, to encase them in ice of my own making for the trip home. It made me rub the ring on my hand. I had given it to Gabriel before the fight, luckily, as I usually wore it on my right hand. He protested taking it, but it was good that he had. Placing the hill and using the ring were just another thing I had put off until the city was finished. The more I thought about it, the more cases of me doing that popped up. "Gabriel," I called. He wasn't far away, as both he and my mother were nearby watching the same sunrise as me. They likely had wildly different thoughts running through their head, though. His eyes found mine. "Can you go get Hal for me, please?" He soundlessly agreed and left to go find the man in question. The sounds of activity had been getting louder as the light got brighter, and I doubted he wasn't up already. Hal was a morning person. One of my first orders of business required his input, and it was the last thing I needed to do before we left. Both men came walking back toward me a few moments later. Hal was dressed in his normal scouting gear again, his more robust fighting armor already packed away. "Hal, how many of our scouts remain?" I asked. "Most," he answered. "They were the least impacted by the fighting. That was good. It would make my next request easier." "How many have no family back in Frostheim? No one waiting on them to come back?" I asked. Hal hesitated, confused by the question. "I don't know. That isn't something I keep track of." I nodded, expecting that answer. "Can you check? A small group is all I need. 5 or 6 people should do it." While Hal wasn't technically in charge of the scouts, he was who they all reported to. A somewhat unofficial leader. Yet another thing I had put off. He nodded before going out into the wider camp. "Why do you need people without family?" Gabriel asked suspiciously. His suspicions made me laugh. "Nothing nefarious, brother. I just have a mission for them." "Why does it require those conditions?" "The task I have for them will delay their arrival back home. If people are waiting for them, and they are missing when we return, they will think the worst even if I claim otherwise," I said. I couldn't imagine their family and friends all grouping up to search for their faces only to realize they weren't among the people who returned. That would be cruel. I could tell Gabriel's curiosity was rising, but I said no more. It was a little fun to leave him in the dark and guessing. It wasn't long before Hal came back for the second time, with the requested people in tow. A group of 6, a mix of male and female, all wearing the green and brown leathers of what scouts usually wore during the summer months. Some with daggers on the hip, others with bows on their back. "Thank you for coming," I started. "The reason I have called you is simple. This battle has enlightened me on some things that need to change. Firstly, our city's strength. We fielded a quarter as many men as Fort Hope. I mean to rectify that. I need you to go southeast, further away from home, and recruit all who are willing to join. Toronto is no more, and I want you to start there. In a city that once held millions, there should be thousands still looking for a home. Promise them work, a means to support themselves, shelter, and security in return for citizenship. Any who join the Guards will be rewarded, and any who have, or are willing to change to, these professions will be rewarded as well," I said while pulling out a parchment I wrote the previous day. It was a list of all the professions we still needed. Farmer, miner, quarry worker, administrative staff, managerial roles, engineer, architect. The list went on, but those were the top few we needed most. We had enough farmers currently, but if we were to rapidly expand our population like I wanted, more would be required. Miner and quarry workers were still needed, one more than the other now that a second mine would be worked. Administrative staff and managerial roles were to help manage all the people I expected to arrive. Our main influx of people came from Austin's recruitment, and I aimed to institute more. This group of 6 would only be the first I sent out. Knowing that there were thousands in the Toronto area was only my good fortune. To facilitate their journey, I gave them packs filled with travel rations and the materials they would need. We had a surplus of supplies as we packed enough to last a few months, and we wouldn't be needing that many now that the fighting was over. Also, I want you to keep a lookout for any traces of demons or of people you suspect have or might summon one. Don't take any action. but notify us and we will handle it. I added before the group could leave. All manner of scouts, rangers, and rogues had used all the skills at their disposal to find any runaway demons, but one couldn't be too careful, especially when the main culprit behind the summoning was never found. It had been too long since it first happened, and the person could be anywhere by now. Plus, without powerful investigative skills, it was impossible to tell. We didn't even know what kind of deal they made in the first place. It could have been for an item, equipment, a skill, or even a technique of some kind. Leaving the problem unfinished irked me, but there was nothing I could do about it. We didn't have dedicated trackers or investigators to delegate the task to. Another thing I meant to change. With their task set and their bags packed, the small group mounted on horses we could spare and rode off. Some of the fallen wouldn't be needing them anymore, and we could easily spare 6 for such a task. With that taken care of, there was nothing left to do before we left. We would make a short stop at Fort Hope and then be on our way back home with only a short conversation in between. And hopefully not a fight. Our large group took a while to get moving, but we made decent time once we did. The trip to Fort Hope would take a week, but that was fine. It would give me more time to recover. Remy chuffed from under me. "I know I'm unbalanced, you ass," I said. My companion had been happy to see me after the battle, and I was happy to see him. Since this was my first time riding him since he had made his aggravations known. I had tried to balance out his saddle by packing more on my right side, but that didn't seem to work. He still chuffed no matter how many times I moved things around. The riding aggravated my wounds, but I powered through the pain. It had diminished as the days went by, but sitting upright while riding didn't help. Cold meditation and healing worked to fix most things, but I was still far from a clean bill of health. Ashley was a good healer, but my body had always taken a while to fix. Even before the massive influx of fortitude, strength, and endurance only making it harder. I was lucky I was still at the Body of Wood stage, as that already made things difficult. If I had been at the Body of Stone stage, my arm would take forever to regrow. Still, I was well enough to fight if the need arose, and that was all that mattered. I even had time to practice manipulating ice as I rode. I had already spent time using ice limbs as Gabriel suggested, but it was different when the entire thing was missing. During practice, I had encased my limb in ice and used that to articulate the appendage, but it was entirely different to have the entire thing ice. There was no base to work off of. Nothing to anchor the ice to underneath. The training I did helped speed my acclimation along, but I was still a while away from anything elegant. The strain on my mind was also going down. The fine manipulation skills needed to move the arm were above my current skills, and it strained my mental ability to keep it active for long. I was used to large-scale manipulation of ice while fighting, not the fine, precise movements fingers required. After a week spent practicing, I could keep the arm formed indefinitely, but I could only use it for a couple of hours a day, and it was still clunky. I wouldn't be enchanting anything intricate anytime soon, but I was making great strides in compensating for what was lost. Fighting with it was out of the question, but I only needed the one arm for that. Even though arriving at Fort Hope meant discussions would soon follow, I was still relieved to see the city's walls when they came into view. Many of our group were. It was hard to blame them as people lined up to welcome our return. Seeing the heartfelt reunions made me eager for our own. It was nice to watch the people hug and embrace their families after the fight, but it didn't feel the same as watching my own people do it. There was a distance between us and them after the rising tensions that delineated the two camps, dampening the goodwill. There were still smiles and tears of joy to be had from all around, but there was a marked difference between us and them. The fact an uncomfortable conversation was to be had the following day didn't help matters either. But before that could happen, there was one thing I needed to do before we left, either amicably or not so amicably. My beautiful little niece was in need of a birthday gift. My ability with glass wasn't the best, but there was bound to be at least one glassblower or a crafter that could fill in inside a city of this size. All I needed to do was find them. The enchantments for what I had in mind were already worked out. I had spent a good chunk of time coming up with what to get her. I even decided to grab a little something for Josh as well. It wasn't his birthday, but it felt wrong to leave him out. It wasn't as grand as what I had in mind for Anna, but Josh had always been easy to get gifts for. The little weirdo loved rocks. Before their house was destroyed, Abigail complained about his collection endlessly. He was constantly picking up rocks from wherever they went, and his pile of rocks only grew. He refused to throw any out, no matter how much Abigail pleaded. I had been a contributor of many in his collection. It was easy to pick out a nice rock wherever I went, and the fact it irked my sister only urged me on. My rock of choice was already made, and it was settled in my saddlebag. I found it in the crystal pit, and there were even specks of gem residue comprising it. Not enough to be a geode, but enough to make it pretty. Josh's love for rocks only extended so far into crystalline structures. He would be enthused about a crystal, but he would be overjoyed about a cool rock. Anna, on the other hand, had a different collection. She enjoyed the finer things in life and, like with Josh, all her collection had been wiped out during the change. She loved snow globes, and I figured with my powers and enchanting ability, I would be able to make a spectacular first piece for her new collection. I just needed to find a good glassblower. Chapter 204. We're leaving. After returning to Fort Hope, Ashton, Carson, and the rest of their city's leadership broke off to resettle the crowd and the people they brought back. Our talks weren't set to begin right away, and they needed time to reorganize their city after what happened. I was in no rush, mostly because I was not looking forward to round 2 of diplomacy, and also because I had other things to do anyway. Other than looking for a glassblower, I had other tasks to complete in the city now that the threat was dealt with. Most of the supplies sent with us needed to be sold or traded. Abigail packed away anything our city could spare as exports so we could have some buying power in case we saw anything this city had that we didn't. I also had most of our treasury on me for that exact purpose. Trade and market research were my goals, and I wasn't the only one out scouting the trading hub. Most of our 200-man group were doing the same. Those that could walk anyway. Most for their own purposes of buying whatever caught their fancy, but most just wanted to explore the new city as we didn't have a chance when we arrived. There were things I noted down to buy, but nothing huge stuck out as I strolled through the stalls. From my first visit, it seemed the city's leadership kept a tighter leash on things being bought and sold, which filtered the good stuff out. Still, I did pick up on things worth buying. The wooded area around their camp was of a higher grade than ours, leading to better logs and planks after it was processed. With the lake nearby, they had another food source that we didn't. Most of the fish for sale looked like what the world had before, but I wouldn't be sure until I tried it. It had been a while since I had a good fish fry. Other than pulling fish out of the lake, there was other aquatic vegetation for sale, but I didn't know what it was for. It didn't look like kale or seaweed, and I certainly wouldn't be putting it in my mouth, but it was marketed all the same. A reagent of some kind, maybe? It was outside my area of expertise, and others were in charge of exploring the market for that kind of thing. I kept a lookout for anything useful for blacksmithing or enchanting while others were in charge of the other professions. Connor would be upset if we left something useful behind. I had already passed by Mitchell, who was studying the wood for sale. As our resident carpenter after Scott, he was in charge of all things wood-related. Without Vinny, metals and crystals fell to me. I would send Jonathan and the other merchants later, but this was just to survey what was available while also noting down what the nearby dungeon provided. That way we knew what the city's likely export would be, which was clearly wood. Depending on how often they delved the dungeon, they would have a surplus of wood to sell off. I didn't have the time to run the dungeon myself and get a complete picture of what it gave, but seeing people leaving with logs of the stuff was easy enough to note down. Honestly, Vinny and I got lucky having one of our nearby dungeons give metal, or we would have had to prospect for it, which did not sound fun. Neither of the 2 pylons we could reach through our market had metal for sale. I suspected the 2 pylons we had access to were here, Fort Hope, and the one south of here they tried to contact as they were the closest we knew of. Other than market research, my trip through the town was to get a better look at it. I had been led through quite quickly the first time, and while I got a good look at most things, it was nice to leisurely stroll around. They were even nice enough to not have someone watch me. A measure of trust one appreciated but wouldn't impact how our talks would go. It didn't take long until someone found me and said that Ashton was ready for me. I had gotten all the things I needed to get done finished anyway. My walk toward their town hall was similar to the first time I was here, except there wasn't the budding tension in the air or people frantically building what defenses they could. Even with the threat vanquished, there was still a lot of activity coming in and out of the town hall. What the various runners or messengers were doing was beyond me, but I figured it was run-of-the-mill stuff. We had people like that in our own city, even if Abigail tried to do it all herself. Most of the parchment had changed inside the first room. Instead of battle lines and planned fortifications, it transitioned into future city plans. I wasn't able to get a good look at them, but I did notice multiple defensive structures were present in the plans. It seems they took that lesson to heart. I was led down the same hallway as before and even to the same room. It was probably Ashton's office or dedicated meeting room. The same 4 people were inside as the last time. Except there were changes. Ashton's armor had dents, holes, and lines carved into it, along with a shield that was nearly mangled. Nathan? Nick? Noah? Whatever the other man's name was sat in a similar state. He had clear wounds on his body, though, which was more than I could say for Ashton. The last 2 were in the best shape, and it wasn't hard to guess why. They weren't melee warriors, which left them with fewer injuries than the other 2. Both Carson and Victoria were in much better shape, but it was clear they at least saw some battle. The ranger stood out as she felt significantly more powerful than before, along with Ashton's growth. They didn't speak as I walked in and continued to be silent as I sat down. They knew my position even before I walked in here, as I made no moves to hide it. Instead of starting off discussing ownership, I went for something else. Something that had stoked my anger for the days following the battle but had died down to simmering coals now that I had calmed down. Where were you? Like a knife, I cut to the heart of the matter with my first words. Ashton at least had the decency to act apologetic. I did what I thought was best. We didn't have the strength or the numbers to continue with the plan we had decided on, he said. We knew that going in, I said. We were supposed to go in, take out the leader, and then kill as many as possible. The plan was more complicated than that and had more nuance, but that was the gist of what Ashton and I were supposed to do. We hoped that killing the leader would destabilize the army, making it easier to kill them. We didn't know killing the leader would take out most of the army. How was I supposed to know that? If I had, I wouldn't have done what I did. Ashton shook his head sadly. Couldn't leave them. They would have died without me there. The anger I thought was dying down flared briefly before I calmed it down. And my side wouldn't have, I said, anger leaking in. I knew from the numbers of those lost. Those who fought under Ashton had a survival rate nearly 20% higher than our side. He traded the lives of his city for those from mine. Ashton straightened, firming his resolve. I will not apologize for what I did. I could not leave them to die. I did what I thought was best. And my people paid for it. I added. Some of the dead had come from my hometown. They traveled thousands of miles with me only to fall because one man had to be the hero. The coals threatened to ignite, to be released and raise the hammer at my side. But I pushed it down. If a fight was to occur, I wouldn't be the one to start it. Instead of arguing over something I knew would make me angry, and most likely get nowhere, I transitioned. I used that falter on his side to slide into the crux of the matter. As recompense for your blunder, ownership of the mine will be ours. We did not have to come and help, we did not have to fight with you, and you certainly didn't have to throw away our plans. We will award all those who fought in either crystals or gold after they're sold for their participation in the battle. I eyed him firmly. Even you will be rewarded. I didn't want to, but he did fight. We will also give you 10% of all profits on the condition you supply workers and guards to man it. We would still pay them. This was to keep Ashton from banning any of his citizens from working the mine. We didn't have the manpower to both run our city and have people work the mine. If we were to start drawing resources out of the mine in any reasonable time frame, help would be required. They shifted, uncomfortable with giving up their claim. 10%. We were the main force that unearthed the mine. We lost double the numbers you did against the demons, and you're giving us a tenth, Ashton exclaimed. I wanted to give you nothing. I snapped back. On account of the fact we are still neighbors and will be for the foreseeable future, I controlled that impulse and have offered you 10. In reality, I was fine with giving him up to 20 but had to start lower. We didn't have the manpower needed to work the mine, and if giving away 20% opened up that possibility, I thought it was worth it. It still burned inside to give away any to a man who lied to me, but that was something I would eat. Plus, giving away a percentage would get me more than only workers. The mine was much closer to his city than ours. If we could sell it through his pylon instead, it would cut down on travel time tremendously. It would also give us a foot in the door here. The people we stationed to run the mine would be able to keep an eye on them as well. While mainly it was to ensure more demons weren't summoned, it was conveniently another way to keep track of their advancements. That's not good enough. Not nearly enough for the blood we paid to acquire it, he said. My efforts to contain my aura after it had grown by so much faltered and billowed out into the room. With it, the air chilled and I could see them tense from the pressure. Do not speak of paying in blood after what you did. It was near a whisper, but I knew they heard it loud and clear. I managed to pull everything back in after my outburst, but they were still unnerved. I had overpowered Ashton's aura once already, but this time it was pointed directly at him instead of over a crowd. The confined room we were in didn't help matters either. The first to react was the ranger, who had her hand on a knife long before the other three did anything. I knew there was something different about her. She hadn't attacked or made any intention of doing so, but she was ready to defend herself as soon as I let my aura out. She also handled it the best, as the other three's shoulders dropped from the pressure. I waved that away. Now wasn't the time to be impressed. Even so, 10 is not enough, Ashton said, regaining his confidence. The lowest I can go is a 60 to 40 split. I nearly laughed. That was out of the question, but at least he was willing to give up majority ownership. I will give you 15. 70 to 30. 18. I countered. You have broken your word once, and you will find no more help from us. Frostheim will be forever closed to any requests for aid. He pushed back. 30 is already generous, and I can say the same for your city. 20 or I'm done here. That is the highest I will go, and unlike you, I mean what I say. If you are still unhappy with that. I stood from my chair. I will tell you the same thing I did before. Fight me for it. All four of them looked at me incredulously, taken aback at my not-so-concealed threat. Ashton and the other warrior even looked at my icy arm as I said it, wondering if I was serious while I was one arm down. Their displeasure was clear even to a child. They turned to each other and spoke in hushed tones I didn't care to eavesdrop on. Fine. We will draw up the contract as soon as possible. The words were like poison coming out of his mouth, and they were no doubt painful to say. We shook. Satisfied, I turned to leave. Before I made it through the door, the ranger spoke up for the first time. What was the explosion? She asked. No matter how much I think about it, I can't think of the reason for an explosion that large. You don't have the mana for it. The last part was a bit of a dig, but I knew she didn't mean it as an insult. She was right, I didn't have the mana for it. 1 foot out the door, I turned to answer. They were making a portal. With that, I left. I didn't explain anything else, as the rest was obvious. I wasn't as nice and listened in as best I could at their mummering. One claimed I was lying while another said it was impossible. I had thought the same before I saw it. It was supposed to be. Leaving the town hall behind, I made my way to the area we had set up in. Without the threat and a recent population decline, there was enough room for us to fit inside the city. With everything else settled, it was time to go home. Not everyone was back yet, as they were either shopping or just looking around, and a sly smile grew on my face. Some of the anger was still there after the conversation, not fully let out as I didn't want to go too far and cause problems, but now was the perfect time to use it. It was rude of me to do so, but I didn't care. For the first time since I gained so many levels, I let everything go. The weight I tried to keep contained opened the gates, and I spread it throughout the entire city. We weren't sure how auras were related to strength, and sadly, I didn't have enough to cover the whole city. It settled over a decent amount, but I clicked my tongue at the lacking coverage. With what little manipulation of it I could, I spread it out to fix that. The overall strength went down, but the range it spread increased. Thinned, but I wasn't using it as an attack. I used it to issue a command. We're leaving. Chapter 205 Cynical. Dear Abigail. Dear Sister. Sister. Bah, you know who this letter is meant for already. It doesn't need a greeting. This isn't the only letter being sent back, so I will keep it short. We have vanquished the enemy and are marching home. We still have scouts out scouring the countryside for traces of any rogue demons, but I don't suspect there will be many. The evolved demon in charge was much stronger than anticipated and makes me believe the leash it kept on its fellow demons was tight. Still, it doesn't hurt to be thorough. Fort Hope has also dedicated some scouts to the same purpose, but I don't feel comfortable leaving it solely to them. With their help, we should be able to catch them all, hopefully. The only task left unfinished is finding the summoner. Every attempt to do so has been met with failure. No matter how hard we look, the culprit eludes us. Everyone was told to be on the lookout, but I doubt that will be of any use. Now, before you go reading anyone else's letter, I informed the messenger to give you mine first. No matter how poorly of a state they claim I am in, don't believe them. Especially Ashley. It's not as bad as it sounds, I'm just a little lighter now. I think this is the least I've weighed since high school. That joke doesn't really make sense without seeing me. I'm told the road to recovery will be long, but I'm confident it will be swift. My lovely sister will make sure of that. I will go into the finer details of everything that occurred when I see you in person, as I don't wish to recount it in this letter for multiple reasons. Other than that, there is one more thing I should inform you of. My recent struggle has highlighted some things that need to change. I have been too passive in our advancement and I aim to fix that. The first of which is recruitment. I have sent out a squad of scouts toward the remnants of Toronto in order to gain any who wish to join our ranks. I plan to do the same when I get back to other parts of the country. I'm unsure how effective it will be, but seeing how many Austin has sent our way since he left gives me hope that our efforts will work as well. That being said, it would be best to plan for a population increase in the coming months. In addition to this letter, I have added a list of the professions I told the scouts to look out for and offer rewards for, but that doesn't ensure they will join. Add any you see fit to the list so it can be added when the next round goes out. We need to be prepared in case our current number of farmers doesn't increase in proportion to our total population. I am sorry to drop this on you with little warning, but it needs to be done. Our pace of advancement needs to increase. All my other plans can wait until I return and we can discuss our best course of action then. I hope Jonathan and the kids are well. I'll be home soon. P.S. Tell Anna and Josh I have a surprise for both of them when I get back. One I'm sure you'll love. Abigail. Below is a recounting of all injuries sustained during the fight and what my body scan was able to discover. Don't tell Christopher I sent you this, as he strictly told me not to. While he was touch and go at first, he should make a full recovery. Regards, Ashley. For broken ribs and 3 fractured ribs. Broken femur, tibia, and fibula on both legs. More fractures than I can list. 1 broken wrist. 1 collapsed lung. Numerous ruptured discs. Severe concussion. Multiple organ failure. Dislocated right shoulder. Amputation of the right arm below the shoulder joint. Our march back home was more than welcome. A general feeling of glee was radiating from our group as everyone was looking forward to returning home. There was still the undercurrent of sadness. One look at the many ice coffins could bring someone down, but most chose to look at the bright side. The threat against us was defeated, and our mission was successful. Among the many things we would do after returning, a heartfelt send-off was high on the list, second only to reunions. Thinking of what I was going to do made me think of how we would do it. For all of my life, burial or cremation was the most common way to send someone off. I was partial to burials, but that didn't mean everyone had the same views. Additionally, with our new magical world, death mana was an affinity out there. I hadn't seen it, and no one we knew had it as their affinity, but it was still a thing. Other forms were probably out there too. With the myriad of affinities we already knew of, saying some form of death mana wasn't out there was stupid. That being said, would bodies rise from the dead? While I hadn't seen it and hadn't heard anyone mention such a thing, it needed to be considered in how we would do things. If there was a chance of undeath from burial, that would have to be considered. No one would want that fate to befall their loved ones. There had to be a way to keep that from happening. A formation or enchantment of some kind to ensure that wasn't possible. Other options came to mind as well. The Viking way particularly, as it was in line with the theme we had going. Other than the smaller lakes, there wasn't a large body of water we could use, though. I still preferred burial, but I would leave the option open to whatever the person wanted. Unless they requested being shot out of a cannon, I didn't care one way or the other. Even though a month had passed, it felt like we arrived the next day. People nearly took off in a sprint when the walls came into view. As soon as we were spotted, it looked like the whole city came out to cheer for our return. The praise felt good. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity as every emotion on the spectrum was exuded by people in the crowd. Exuberance and happiness for those hugging their returned loved ones. Deep grief and sadness for those looking on at icy coffins. Gratefulness and joy at knowing the threat against them was defeated. It was a lot to take in. One group was hugging each other tight in joy while another was sobbing over ice. My own family was one of the lucky ones. All of us returned, even if some weren't in the pristine condition they left in. Abigail nearly lost it when she saw me, and I had a sneaking suspicion she knew what to expect. Without foreknowledge, I anticipated her to be more animated at the state I returned in. Anna and Josh marveled over my new arm. Anna said it looked cool and wanted to play with it while Josh just poked at it in wonder. Vinny just laughed and said forging would be harder. The rest of their reactions were in line with what I had expected. Everyone spent a long time hugging and talking, and it was a much-needed unwind after what we faced. Even if a particular person's lecture went on and on. The following day was a much more somber affair. With the amount of dead that chose burial, a cemetery was planned out and constructed in record time. Abigail, with her magical ability to think ahead, already marked out a spot to place it, but just hadn't started building it yet. I had no idea how long it would last or if it was big enough, but all those worries could wait for another day. Nearly the entire city watched as people were laid to rest. Last words were said and tears stained the earth. My ice kept the bodies from decomposing during our trip, which let people view them for the final time. I fogged up the ice on some as it wasn't a pretty sight. As they were placed into their final resting place, I voiced my thanks for their sacrifice and dispelled the ice around them so they could return to the earth. It didn't get any easier as the day went on. Everyone hurt just as much as the others. As that completed and I left the family to grieve alone, there was one last thing to do. The ring on my finger brought me comfort to wear. It had become a habit to rub it at certain times, and now it was time to place it. Part of me didn't want to. It whispered that construction wasn't done and I should wait, but my day spent burying people shot that down. Waiting any longer would be stalling, and I had done enough of that. Similar to the cemetery planned in what would be our future city, there was another spot sectioned off. Inside what would eventually be the inner wall, an idyllic spot was set aside for just that purpose. It bordered the cliffside and gave a stunning view of the landscape down below. A forest of green as far as the eye could see. I didn't think there was a better place for miles around. Using the ring was instinctual. It probed my mind for where I wanted to place it, and similar to any other system construction, it worked in ways I couldn't decipher. A blink and it was like the hill had always been there. The ring that I had worn for over a year turned to dust and blew away in the wind. After watching so many others shed tears over the day, it was my turn to do the same. Not much was said as my family looked on. Just a quiet remembrance. The following days were gloomy, but the liveliness came back. This wasn't people's first experience with loss, and sadly, wouldn't be the last. It felt odd to wake up in my own bed after everything that happened, and I doubted I was the only one who felt that way. My daily routine had to be amended as the dungeons were off-limits to me. Doctor's orders. Instead, I got caught up on everything I had missed during my 3-month journey. It hadn't felt like that much, but it was already well into summer and nearly fall. Not that the leaves would start changing soon, but it was a bit of a reality check to see the crops I had helped plant nearly grown upon my return. For most everything that happened, Abigail handled much better than I could, but she did set aside a few things I needed to handle. Luckily, I didn't need to enforce laws on anyone. Jonathan made sure there was nothing lax while we were gone. It was mostly small things. The construction crew was waiting for me to engrave the wards before they could continue, and other status updates of similar importance. It wasn't until our council meeting 3 days after our return that I felt decently caught up on the happenings and better understood the state of the city. The room was far from the sparsely decorated gray drab it once was. Rugs and furs lined the floor, giving it a comfortable feel along with trophies or the like hung on the walls. It was a stark difference and one I had to comment on. "I turn my back for 1 second and you redecorate the whole place," I joked. "If I left it to you, it would be years before you put anything up," Abigail said. I was glad for the change though. With her moving into the castle along with her 2 little ones, it did need a homier touch that it had been missing. A warmth that it now had. It was a welcome change. The meeting was one of the longest ones we had ever had, as both sides had much to discuss. Specifics of what occurred needed to be detailed. The discussion over our new mine took nearly an hour alone. I know this is another draw on our manpower, but it's a high priority. It will take a while, maybe a few months, to get a mine up and running, but the sooner we do, the sooner we can start growing the dungeons. They should be close to a 9th floor already, which would change a lot. More income from taxes, better loot from the new floor, more essence to those that can clear it. Faster leveling for the strongest in the city. Part of the agreement with Fort Hope was that they would provide a portion of the workers, so that should help, but if we want to get a steady supply of crystals, we probably need to send our best. I stated, if we do that, our supply of stone will go down. We just got up to speed and are quarrying it at a rate just enough to keep up with construction. If we send off the best miners, we will be behind again. Abigail said, I know, but they are better used at the crystal mine. Hopefully, their expertise will help get the initial construction up and running faster. I agree that with you, but I needed to tell you the drawbacks that will occur. I won't know by how much stone production will go down without speaking to Francis, but it will be by a significant amount. Can we get it from anywhere else? Austin mentioned where he's at is selling stone. I asked. Everyone looked to Jonathan. As it is now, our market can't reach that far. We would either need to upgrade the pylon or build a trading hub somewhere in the city, he said. I sighed hearing that. I don't know the runes for something like that. All my focus has been on the wards. But we should prepare to upgrade the pylon anyway. It's been delayed enough already. Everyone nodded at that. After our side was finished, it was Abigail's turn. Everything went mostly according to plan. Construction is ahead of schedule and the crops are growing nicely. We've had major advancements for both farmers and miners that have accelerated things. Most of what she described was to be expected. All until she was wrapping up. Our income from the dungeons suffered, but that's to be expected. The new mine will help bring us back some coin. Besides that, not much happened except for one thing. She finished recapping. Before anyone could say anything, she shifted around the papers in front of her and presented what looked to be an envelope. While you guys were gone, we received a letter from another pylon. She had everyone's attention after another pylon was mentioned. I didn't recognize the name or the symbol on the letter either. The city's name is Mountainside. We aren't sure where they're located, but we predict it's somewhere west of here. Most likely near Calgary. My eyes were still glued to the opened envelope as she spoke, and a growing concern welled up inside me. What did it say? I asked. Because I swear to God, if it's another dire warning, I might just lose it. She shook her head fiercely. No, nothing like that. It's a request for trade and an offer to reopen communications. It's written fairly straightforward and doesn't say much else. No threats they need help with? No demands for anything? No proposing of an alliance? I questioned with narrowed eyes. Not even any veiled threats. In response, she tossed me the letter to read for myself, and even then, it still didn't feel right. All it stated was an openness to begin trade and discuss future cooperation. If everyone at the table hadn't reacted with the same scrutiny, I would have thought I'd become cynical. Chapter 206 Militarization. As the days passed since our return, many things that needed doing were still stacked on my plate. With my schedule opened up in the morning, when my usual dungeon runs would occur, new things were slotted in to fill up my day. My continued study of enchantments and wards took up some of the time while most was allocated for something else. I needed to stop delaying taking actual charge and forging more permanent additions to my city. The first of which was the establishment of a guard company. There was a mixture of reasons I had held off on doing so, but all of that silliness was left behind. After fighting the demons and nearly dying, my hang-ups felt childish. Other than the financial burden for permanent guards, it was an authority thing. I had shied away from it at first in the tutorial, but when I picked it up later, I picked all of it up. I was the head of many things as the leader, and it was nice to know that I was the sole person in charge in case things went wrong. The bits of authority I gave away were to my family, who I trusted completely. Abigail the most. Creating guards was something I would have to branch out for, hiring people who were not related to me and people I wasn't sure I could trust. It was my biggest hang-up before the demons, but now I didn't care. Well, saying I didn't care was wrong. More like I grew comfortable with the idea of loosening the reins now. The people showed their honor, they traveled the land at my call and fought with their lives on the line. It was dishonorable to continue doubting them. They showed their trustworthiness and respect, and now I needed to return it. The first guard company would be formed in Frostheim, and I knew just the man to lead it. Other than hiring official guards, we needed information. The way the demonic threat popped up was a major cause of concern, and I did not want it happening again. We had to find out about it from another pylon, which was unacceptable. No threat should be able to remain close without our knowledge. Being aware of the whole world was too much, even the entire continent, but we should at least know what was happening nearby. Until we had the resources to expand that scope to even further. Executing all my different plans took some time away from my training, but I was fine with that for now. My involvement wouldn't be needed forever, only to get the ball rolling and to put people in charge to run things. The last big thing that I took care of was sending people west. Mountainside had sent a letter and my response was ready. I hadn't sent a delegation or even someone to negotiate anything, only a letter detailing my response. I was fine with opening communication and enthusiastic about trade, but I was curious how they were going to go about doing it. The trip would take months, even in good weather, and I didn't see that being fixed anytime soon. Winter being on the horizon would only make things worse. Still, I welcomed it and said as much in my letter. It was up to them how they wished to go from there. The last thing I planned to do had to wait, though. While I could fight, I wasn't in tip-top shape. My dexterity in my new arm was growing by the day, but I wasn't as good at manipulating it during a fight. I could one-hand one of my formed hammers, but waiting until I was recovered wouldn't take that long. Doctors put it in the middle of winter, but I felt it would be closer to the beginning. Other than the letter sent to Mountainside, I had another one delivered down south to Austin. I wasn't sure what he was up to, but I let him know the threat had been dealt with and to keep an eye out for any talk of demons. Taking days off fighting was weird, but my mind was busy with implementing the changes I needed to make and time slipped by. Marcus. Point of view. Their attack into the heart of the insect's territory was going better than he thought it would. They had fought tooth and nail for every foot of territory conquered from the insects, and now they were pushing for the center. The bodies of dead bugs could be stacked higher than any local mountain by this point, and the disposal of them had long been a problem. The storehouses were full of anything they could provide, and their chitin was overflowing by this point that they didn't even bother to skin anything below E rank. Even then, low E ranks were beginning to be left behind. The campaign against them was brutal. Months of fighting were required to push them back from an area, and they needed to be constantly ready for counterattacks. Slowly, ever so slowly, his city gained ground. It was a dungeon at first, giving them an avenue for resources and growth while also taking away the mana the bugs were using to grow. They swarmed around anything with enough mana or in areas of high mana density, the three surrounding dungeons chief among them. Gaining their first dungeon showed the first distinguishable change. His people grew faster than the insects could keep up with. Every battle since then gave them that much more. More bugs fell during the fighting, more essence flowed into the people, and more resources were able to be gathered. It was a change in the tide, and Marcus could feel it shift in his very bones. While saying he could feel the tide change was mainly metaphorical, something told him he wasn't far off. A feeling inside him hummed at the thought. Now, Marcus stood atop the battlements watching those under him leading the charge. He wanted to be down there. His body twitched to be down there, but he held back. Patience and planning held him back. While they gained ground, the bugs fought that much harder to get it back. Every strike launched against them was met with an equal and opposite retaliation. His glaive was needed to face what would come after, not what they faced now. Still, he couldn't keep the feeling at bay. Watching others attack while he stood and did nothing went against everything he felt a leader should be. He was used to leading from the front, leading the charge among the vanguard. That honor was given to another, someone who had grown on Marcus, even if he would die before admitting that fact. The frivolous, cavalier little shit would gloat until the day Marcus died if he mentioned that he was growing fond of his presence. He was the embodiment of everything Marcus wasn't. He shirked responsibility faster than water could roll off a duck. He refused to be serious. His rising heart rate forced him to center himself. Somehow, the man was able to get on each and every nerve, knowing where to press and how hard to get a reaction. It was unnerving to be seen through like that, which only made it worse. As much as the man grated on Marcus, he could admit he was a central pillar to their attack strategy. Without him, it would have taken a lot longer to do what they had, maybe months before they would have reached where they were. Longer still to get the resources they needed. Growing out of the city gave them the needed space to take care of nearly everything they lacked. Fertile ground was conquered and held. Seeds were planted and grown. Harvest was nearly upon them. Harvest. It had been nearly 2 years since that had happened, and it came at the perfect time. Food. Blessed food. It was enough to bring a cheer through the city. Other than food, water flowed in. Their efforts to dig through the solid rock under their feet were rewarded, and they hit the depth required to reach the watershed. No more runs to the river were needed for survival. It was hard to pin the changes to the exact day their fate changed, but he knew the man fighting down below was a big part of it. Speaking of, he needed to keep track of the battle happening. Austin, the man in question, led the charge and was doing a remarkable job. Letting the outsider lead was hard on Marcus, but he was able to extend his hand in the end. Light shot out, spearing another insect as he danced around those surrounding him. Marcus witnessed the ease in every move, the confidence that every stab would land. It spoke to the experience of many battles. Light and searing heat were his main weapons, but his spear wasn't far behind. Similar to Marcus, he utilized his weapon well, empowering and extending what he could do with it through his powers. Others among the front line he was observing were the opposite. They relied on their powers to deal the damage and used their weapon to launch it. While opposite to what he did, he wasn't experienced enough to call it wrong. The mages stood behind, creating grand feats of magic while rangers unleashed arrow after arrow. Some broke apart into a carpet of them, raining down on a wide area and piercing numerous bugs. Others flew through the air with a growing power that penetrated through the swarm of bugs, taking multiple down before it ran dry. The methods were numerous, but all had a practiced ease behind them. A will behind them that meshed into the whole. Their charge stalled as the swarm thickened. The bugs rallied to defend their last dungeon while humans sought to defeat them. From the insects' response, Marcus could tell that today wouldn't be the day, but they were getting close. Maybe tomorrow or the day after, but the day they held all 3 dungeons was coming close. The front line realized what he had seen moments ago and started their fighting retreat. One foot placed behind the other while they fought on as they backed away. Ready defenses, Marcus called, and he didn't need to look around to know he was heard. Mechanical locks clanked into place and bowstrings were pulled tight. The ballistae along the walls were knocked and loaded, along with the catapults on the ground behind them. The large boulders one would expect the massive contraptions to launch were nowhere in sight, and instead, a pile of sharpened rocks sat in the catapult's pouch. A form of grapeshot that proved more effective against the swarm of bugs. Marcus wasn't sure he should be proud or disappointed at how fast his city advanced at war. It wasn't too long ago they were waking up to work normal jobs. Yet now weapons were readied and siege preparations were completed within seconds of his order. Watching how fast people came around to militarization made Marcus wonder if the fighting was this fierce everywhere else in the world. The thought was quick, but it was something he would remember later. His attention was needed on the battle, but that was something he would think about when he had time. The massive gate cranked open as the attack force filed into the city. The edges collapsed in first before being followed by the forces in the center. As the gates slammed shut, it was time for Marcus to take over. Orders to fire were unnecessary by this point and had been for a long while. Twangs and creaks sounded down the wall like dominoes falling in both directions. He readied his glaive and slammed the butt into the ground rhythmically. The water inside him started to roil and build. The placid calm his inner lake held beginning to change. The ripples rolling out strengthened with every tap. Soon. The time to unleash the tide would come soon. Tracy. Point of view. Her face recoiled in anger at the letter she read. It took everything in her to not start throwing things. The messenger who delivered it was still standing by her side awaiting a response, and she couldn't make her displeasure known. She knew Nick wasn't the smartest leader, but she had at least thought him smarter than this. Their city flourished under her care, and it was had grown into the regional powerhouse. Other pylons were located, and some had even come under their banner. Their reach had spread as they grew, yet Nick's hunger for more grew with it. Skirmishes and testing probes to the surrounding powers started before Tracy could stop it, and neither could she stop the retaliatory strikes in response. Their neighbors were slighted, and she knew Nick did it on purpose. He burnt the bridge before she was able to make friendly relations. Tracy should have known he would. The City of Storms was too big a prize to give up, and she knew once Nick caught sight of it, they would be doomed. Not doomed in the major sense of the word, but doomed to go along with his ego. He was the master of storms, or so he would claim, and no one else could claim the title. His vanity had only grown in proportion to their land. His thirst for more didn't even last a month before he readied the armies. His letter informing her of his imminent departure along with a sizable chunk of their workforce. The army he formed had some of the crafters she was relying on. The outstanding orders would go unfilled. The trade agreements along with it unless she pulled another magic trick out of her hat. Luckily, Tracy had ingrained in Nick's mind that she was useless on the attack. She was far from it, but it didn't hurt to keep some cards up her sleeve. Remaining weak on the offensive was a weakness she corrected long ago. A certain man forced her to adjust her strategy accordingly. If Tracy ever saw Chris again, she would have to thank him for revealing her oversight. Additionally, it was a way to declaw herself and let Nick believe her non-threatening. Even on the off chance he turned on her, she wanted some surprises up her sleeve. Doing so allowed her to remain behind without being called to war. She could only watch from the walls as thousands marched away. She should have never allowed Nick to go to Chicago, but it wasn't like she could have stopped him either. Chapter 207 Air of Change. Chris. Point of view. It was nice to get back into things and into the groove of what I had left. I hadn't realized that so much of my day was filled with carving formations, directing the castle construction, or managing something else inside the city. All of the responsibilities slowly added up, and it took dropping everything to go fight demons to notice all of what I was doing. Another part that alerted me to how much I was involved with things was Abigail's recap of everything that happened while we were gone. She had a lot of issues crop up in the beginning that I usually handled by myself. My high strength was used as a shortcut for a lot of things that they had to work around without me there. It wasn't much, as I had already been letting go of how much I was involved, but my absence was still noticeable. Another change was I wasn't there to reinforce the stone as best I could. I wasn't sure if anyone else could notice the difference, but I definitely could. The stones placed before and after I left were different. Something about them didn't portray the impenetrable fortress I had envisioned, and it irked me. Fixing that wore my spirit out, but that was what it was there for. If it wasn't meant to be used, then I didn't know what it was there for. While they had noticed changes in my absence, I was nearly flabbergasted when I returned. Abigail had mentioned that the crews were ahead of schedule, but I hadn't expected just how ahead they were. She mentioned that the ones who remained worked themselves more than ever to make up for the people who had left to fight. Some departments even output more than when their entire workforce was there. As outlandish as that sounded, it brought a smile to my face. To know that not only the ones who risked their life but also the ones who stayed behind cared about what we were building filled me with joy. The keep of the castle was mostly finished before we left, but now it was perfected. The last finishing touches of its construction were completed along with all of the interior as well. Furniture was moved in along with all the furs and decorations to turn my home into a home. I figured I had my sister to thank for that, but the list of things I had to thank her for was getting long at this rate. Other than the keep, the outer wall was well on its way. Most of its construction stalled when I wasn't there to carve the wards into the stone, but the fact the massive semicircle even had stones placed was a surprise. The fervor that caused the massive progress while we were gone didn't go away on our return, as there was another reason that people kept up their rapid pace. Once the outer walls were finished, the actual construction could take place. People were still making do with the cabins and lodges that we had made when we first arrived, and they were excited to get into something more permanent. The prospect of their homes being behind walls also had something to do with it. Most of my days were spent catching up on what I had missed. Expending my spirit wasn't causing any harm, and neither was enchanting. Although that took some getting used to. I had to have Gabriel come help do some of the fine detail work because I couldn't, but I was getting better at making do. It was somewhat therapeutic to spend my days constructing. It felt like I had spent long periods of time focused on destruction, and now the coin had flipped. I had felt it in the tutorial as well. Something was there, I could feel it, about the two sides I spent most of my time doing, but I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. It also helped to bring my profession levels more in line with my class levels. I was still far ahead, but it was nice to play the little catch-up I could. Runesmith being rare helped matters, as it didn't take as much essence. The horses being back also helped. We had taken nearly all of them with us to make our trip quicker, which left the city without them. They were the main power behind getting the massive blocks of stone up the cliff. The blocks we were using for the outer wall were even bigger than the ones we used for the castle, being nearly double in size at 8 feet long and half that deep and high. It took multiple horses hooked in together on a harness to pull the things, let alone the amount of people it took. The stories of how they did it while we were gone were hilarious. Sarah, our budding beastmaster, had to direct which horses we used, as not all of them were fond of the work while others loved it. I couldn't tell which was which, but she certainly could. Speaking of our resident beastmaster, she had expanded her work while we were gone. She had originally wanted to come with us, but I firmly denied that. Other than the fact she was still a child, her skill set was better used here rather than in a fight. She still had skills from when she was a ranger and could handle herself well, but I wasn't dragging children off to war. Everyone who went was at least 18. I made sure of that. I still wasn't sure of the specifics of how her skills worked, but she was able to continue her taming efforts on the local wildlife. There was a cap for how many she could keep under her control, and she had hit it with the horses, but things had changed. Honestly, she shouldn't have been able to tame that many in the first place, and the main reason she had was because we were there to help. If she were alone, she wouldn't have been able to. As the horses grew comfortable with us, they required her skills less and less. They weren't instantly docile and had taken some time to get used to their new environment. After they became truly domesticated, she was able to branch out again. I really should have been able to guess what animal she picked. Look at him. Isn't he so cute? She beamed with pride while holding her charge up in the air. Said Charge yowled in displeasure at being put in air jail. White on gray fur that was just beginning to fill out with eyes that were bright and curious at the new world it was being introduced to. A low growl emanated out from the kennel, which made Sarah yelp and apologize, putting the little guy back down. The pup then waddled back over to its mother to join the rest of its siblings wriggling for sustenance. Wolves. That was the animal that Sarah had chosen. She had mentioned getting some when we fought them on the way here, but they all ran away after the fight, leaving her disappointed. She had pitched the idea to Abigail while I was gone, and she had agreed. Sarah using both Josh and Anna to convince their mother that they wanted a dog was a surefire way to get her to agree. Other than getting the kiddos to want a dog, she used other reasons to support her argument that even I had a hard time naysaying. It wasn't that I didn't want the animals, but I felt there were other options that were better. Maybe it was just my bias to seeing Kathy and her birds. I was fine with letting her progress in her class however she wanted, though, and I had to admit, the little furballs were growing on me. She could only tame a few of the wolves around us and managed to tame one that was pregnant, causing the scene I was seeing now. The litter was larger than I expected, but I chumped that up to magic causing some changes. Plus, the birth and recovery were some of the quickest I had ever seen, even without healing skills being used. The natural vitality of beasts wasn't to be underestimated. Even under Sarah's care, the mama wolf did not like other people handling her newborns, which was understandable. It was only slightly disappointing to not be able to play with them. Soon, I told myself, it had been a while since I played with a puppy. One of the points Sarah came up with was pairing a wolf with one of our scouts to enhance their abilities, which would begin when the pups were a little older. Scouts and trackers would both be getting a companion if they so wished. I was sick of not having a good tracker and had dedicated a decent sum to training up a few. Other than Sarah gushing about her new workload, there wasn't much going on. The sun would come up, I would go to work, and the day would pass. There was a zen I fell into while watching the bones of my city being built. Even without my arm, I was probably in the best state of mind since the change, which was odd because I had nearly just died. I figured seeing Anna's reaction to my gift was the biggest factor in washing away my bad mood. Something about seeing her face light up with wonder eviscerated any negative thoughts in my brain. She played with the snow globe I made for hours. Josh also liked my gift but contained himself better than his older sister. As the days passed, the heat of summer dipped and began its descent into fall, and every day felt better than the last. Both Abigail and Ashley spent a large amount of mana healing me, and it took over a month for the pain to go away. They weren't even trying to regrow my arm yet, only working through all the other broken things before they turned their attention there. My body was endlessly surprising me with the amount of punishment it could take. Other than the first harvest, we received word back from the messengers we sent to Mountainside. We were correct in our assumption of where the new city was. They were welcomed when they arrived, fed and sheltered while they were there. It was a good start to what I hoped would be a friendly relationship. I did not want to get on rough terms with another pylon that was close by. Our relationship with Fort Hope was on the mend, but a divide was still clearly there. I had sent Jonathan there to negotiate a trade agreement and also begin management of the mine. I wasn't going to put him in charge and keep him there forever. Abigail would kill me, only to act as our head merchant and negotiate for what we would trade with one another before returning. I expected him back before the snow began in earnest. I offered for Abigail to go with him, but she ended up declining, surprisingly. She said that she had other things on her schedule she needed to do. She had spent a lot of time meditating recently. Maybe she was working on her law or something. Abigail wasn't the only one advancing either. Many of the people who returned from the fight found themselves stepping down various paths of power, some even on multiple. More laws were gained in the months following the battle than the previous year combined. It was slightly alarming. Other than laws, there were even a few that formed their spirit anchors, but they were few and far between. But above all else, body refining was the most common. After seeing how the bodies of those who underwent the process saved them from fatal wounds, people signed up in droves, despite the agonizing pain it caused. The best part about the whole thing was I used it as a recruitment tactic. My family held most of the body refining techniques in the city, and I made them available to all who signed up to be guards, scouts, or trackers. While we didn't have every affinity in our library, we had most of the common ones. Fire, water, wind, earth, ice, and solar, which could work for light. Some were out of luck, but we were able to accommodate most. Those with fire-related affinities had it the best, as the book Rachel bought was nothing if not extensive. While Jonathan had purchased an earth affinity technique, giving the other earth affinity guards a choice solely meant for earth, some chose out of the fire book, mixing earth and fire even though a pure earth option was available to them. Some with the metal affinity did the same. One of the things I wanted to fix once our market was able to reach out was the breadth of techniques we had. Those with rarer affinities were left with few options. Lightning, lunar, nature, blood, and wood were only some of the few affinities of people we had to let down, and that list would only grow as our city did. Even with all the good things happening, and what felt like being in a perpetual good mood, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. It didn't feel like a threat, and it didn't feel like it was aimed at me or my city, but the winds carried an air of change. Chapter 208 Frozen Rift. To the icy bastion that shields me, oh boy has it been a roller coaster. I thought I would go on a cool little adventure to find out what my profession was so pushy about, yet it turned into something more. So much more. Honestly, I'm just glad that you ignored my advice and kept traveling north, because if you listened to me, we would have been drawn into an endless fight with these infernal creatures that only cause suffering. My suffering. Not infernal in the same sense as what you were dealing with, but infernal in the sense that they will be forever the bane to my existence. I swear, even after burning their gore off of me with both intense light and fire, in addition to a vigorous shower and scrubbing, I still find bits of their shell and goo still covering me. What I thought would be a fun few days of insect extermination has turned into months of slogging through their numbers with my newfound friends. The city leader down here reminds me a lot of you and your father. Ever the stoic and dutiful, the stuck-up ass. Oh, if I could only show you the face he makes when I rile him up. He seems like a good man and a good leader, which is more than some of the others I've met. I won't go into detail, but let's just say not everyone I met along my journey got pointed in your direction and got a different point their way. But enough about that. I have other news. Well, various bits of other news. Mainly, we're making progress. With my strength, I am one of the strongest here, and that entails fighting at the front, and I do not envy what you do. I want my hunk of ice shield back so I can use you to block everything. Fighting this way is so much harder. But, with my help, Marcus and his army are getting better and better at fighting off the bugs, and we are finally making meaningful gains in this war. We are marching toward their center as the days pass. I felt the power that radiates from the center of the swarm, and I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that it was the reason behind my profession going haywire. Feels strong. And oddly like when Abigail when she goes all out. And like Marcus, as weird as that sounds. Other than that, with my friends in high places, I've come to know a little more about the surrounding area. There's a pylon in Des Moines which they renamed the same name, which is lame if you ask me, and another to the west called the Reservation. Attached to this letter is where the maps we have say they are located. I still don't know what specific tribe the reservation originated from, or if it's a combination, but it's composed of the Native Americans who used to live there. Other than those two, there's word of another pylon in Chicago that we passed by. People are calling it the City of Storms, and there has been an influx of people coming from that direction. They claim fighting has broken out, and someone declared war in order to conquer the city, but it's been mostly rumors so far. Anywho, I could use your expertise in wholesale destruction if you're up for a fight. Your bestest friend in the whole wide world. Chris. Point of view. A chuckle rang out after reading the signature of the letter. He didn't even sign his name, the bastard. It was rather unfortunate, but I wasn't able to go down and help him. I had too many things to do here, and I still needed to focus on recovery. If I went down to help, away from the healers, it would take that much longer for them to regrow my arm. I was getting good with my icy one, but it was still no substitute for the real thing. I had been cleared for my normal dungeon training, but I was told to stay away from anything too intensive. We weren't sure when the next threat would arise, and I wanted to be fixed up before anything like another demon fiasco happened. The fact that our test was due didn't help. Plus, I couldn't leave now when my plans were just beginning to get off the ground. Not only were the coin and materials I was dragging in necessary, but my presence was needed if I wanted things to start in the right direction. I would eventually hand it off to someone, most likely Jonathan, but he wasn't even here. Even if he was, I wanted to be the one to found it. I had grand plans on how it would turn out, and for that to happen, it needed to get off on the right foot. The coin wasn't that big of an issue for the future, but until we started getting a steady supply of crystals from the mine, we were still rather strapped for it. We would soon be swimming in it, not only from the mine but also from the dungeons. Every level down was that much more valuable, and with everyone coming back a good deal stronger made the taxes we got out of them climb. Even with the losses meaning fewer people delved, we were getting more coins every month. Some groups could even complete the entire dungeon regularly. Unlike before, when it took careful planning and preparation for select groups to defeat the 8th floor, it was now a regular occurrence. That alone caused a huge jump in revenue. I couldn't imagine how much more we would make when the dungeons grew. We were told that there was a substantial change after one reached 10 floors, and I couldn't wait to see what it was. While my days were usually filled, there was something different on the schedule today. I took time off specifically to do something new. I needed to choose my next skill. So far, Hammer of the Jotner was turning out to be an amazing class. Its first skill gave me my beloved hammer, which I still needed to remake. The second gave me a powerful finishing move in Shattering Hammer, and the third gave me a great all-around defensive skill, Jotun's Resistance. It heightened my already impressive fortitude to even new levels. Nothing in the dungeon could even scratch me anymore when I had it running. Other than the fact it was a massive mana hog, it was a terrific skill. It nearly made Frost Armor obsolete. Not that I would stop using the skill, but it was rather pointless when nothing could get past my skin anyway. With half of the skills my class would give me already possessed, I only had 3 more available and I needed to make them count. I wasn't sure what my next class would entail, and I needed to make sure I got everything out of my current one as I could. So far, I had chosen one that summoned a weapon, one that causes massive amounts of damage, and one that increases my defense tremendously. Covered all of the bases. Well, except for the magical side, but none of the skills I was offered could fix that, as it wasn't the point of the class. That being said, it made my next choice hard and was the reason why it had taken me so long to decide. A part of me still hadn't, but I was heavily leaning towards 1 out of the 6. Some were easy enough to eliminate from contention, as I already had skills similar in effect, or there was another skill on the list that did the same thing but better. Or, in one skill's case, an effect I believed I could learn in time without the need for a skill like it. It would take a long time and a lot of practice, but I believed I could do it, and it made me cringe to think about taking it as a skill and essentially wasting the skill slot. It wouldn't really be a waste, but my mind made it feel that way. The one I was leaning towards was called Frozen Rift. Frozen Rift, legendary. Using a compatible weapon, channel a rift in space connected to the lands of eternal winter. Effects that are caused depend on the power expended to create the rift and the intention behind it. To connect deeper to the lands of eternal winter, further your path in its direction. First of all, it sounded powerful. Second, its name was cool. And third, it sounded fucking awesome. Pardon my French. I had a sneaking suspicion that using the skill would cause another string of runes to light up on my hammer similar to Shattering Hammer. From what I could tell, 6 distinct strings ran along the shaft of my weapon, and I guessed they corresponded to 6 different skills. I wasn't sure how I would be able to get them all, as I only had 3 possible skill choices left for my class, but I felt the urge to get them all eventually. While that was the offensive choice I was leaning toward, there was another defensive one that felt decent. Jotun Armor, legendary. Clad your body in the most formidable of icy armor. Created from ice directly tied to the lands of Niflheim, it holds trace amounts of its magic. Able to hold up to even the most powerful of blows, and can break down and consume mana that comes into contact with it that isn't cold aligned. It was a complete upgrade to Frost Armor and sounded perfect, but I wasn't sure if going 2 defensive skills back to back was a good idea. Sure, I took a hit and the skill would have been useful, but I was worried I was overreacting. My near-death scared me, but changing who I was to favor defense didn't seem like the answer. Not to say I would never take the skill, I could still choose it with the remaining 2 slots, but I didn't want my conscious or subconscious to influence me into changing. Leaving Jonathan to the purely defensive path was enough. I still wanted to smash things. Other than those 2, there were more general skills that weren't firmly an attack or defense. One was called Frozen Leech, which sapped energy and mana from the person I was fighting. It was a great addition to my sustainability fighting style. If I could fight for long periods of time against one opponent, not only would I get stronger during the fight, but they would get weaker. The last I was considering was a bit of an odd skill. It didn't sound overtly powerful, but its description made me curious as to what effects it would have. Icy Connection worked to forge a connection between me and my ice that would improve my ability to manipulate and feel what I was doing with it. Not only would it make Sweeping Snow and Desolate Blizzard more powerful and easier to use, but it was its use combined with Frost Armor that made me think about choosing it. It wasn't a powerful skill like Frozen Rift or helped with defense like Jotun Armor, but it would elevate every skill I currently had in addition to every skill I would likely get. Unless something unforeseen happened in the future, the Path of Ice was my future. The fact it wasn't immediately powerful made me not want to pick it, but neither did I outright dismiss it because of that. I knew firsthand the power that came from increased connection to my ice because of my law, and I wasn't going to dismiss the skill because it didn't sound powerful. Ultimately, it was in the same boat as Jotun armor. I had 2 more to choose, and it wasn't like I needed it now. The fact I could always take it later if my next class wasn't as good also helped. Frozen Rift was where I was leaning, and after weeks of thought, I couldn't come up with a reason not to take the skill. There was something in its description that made me pick it above the others. Connected to the lands of eternal winter. What kind of connection? What kind of laws would a land like that have? How much would bleed through the connection? It made me wonder if there was a way to use it to advance my law in addition to fighting with it, and that thought sealed the deal. With my skill chosen, there was only one thing to do before trying out my new toy. It wouldn't work without a compatible weapon, and I was long overdue to recreate my beloved hammer. I was healed, hale and healthy, ready to pour everything I had into the weapon. All of my stat points from the influx of levels had been distributed as well. I had originally thrown half into vitality right away to help with recovery, but I went back and added a few more, bringing it to an even 500. It took a majority of my points, 93 out of 145, but I felt it was worth it. Other than increasing my vitality, I split the remaining 52 points between endurance and acumen. To increase my sustainability of both stamina and mana. I wanted to keep throwing points into wisdom for a bigger mana pool, but without the acumen to back it up, it would take forever to refill. I needed the regeneration now that I had fancy skills that drained my mana at ludicrous rates. Plus, with winter coming soon, I had another way to increase my mana that I couldn't wait to break into. My stats ended up looking quite good in my opinion. Strength, 1,230. Agility, 535. Perception, 315. Fortitude, 979. Endurance, 629. Vitality, 500. Intelligence, 215. Wisdom, 417. Acumen, 256. Free points, 0. Chapter 209 New Toy. While my stats were looking good and my skill choice was finalized, there was one last thing I needed to do before remaking my hammer. I had spent much of my recovery time working on the wards and the formation lining the outer walls, and I had gotten a few levels in my profession. With the addition, it pushed me over level 60, and I now had yet another skill to choose. This one was less impactful than the legendary ones I had to choose from through my class, but it was still something I needed to get done. So far, I had everything I needed for my craft. Sense Metal had upgraded to Sense Frequency. Bumping the rarity up to rare, I wasn't able to get the upgrade I wanted right away, forcing me to push past uncommon and go straight to rare. Create Weapon and Create Armor were both well on their way to rare as well, with only a small push away from being there. Vincent had once again beaten me to the next rarity for our craft. His newly expanded affinity and body worked wonders and pushed him over the edge to creating rare equipment, while I hadn't dedicated enough time to raise my abilities there yet. He could make rare gear before, but it required me or another enchanter to enchant it to push it over the edge. I was intent on catching up and was intent on dedicating some quality time to do so. I had even gotten some practice smithing with my makeshift arm, even if I wasn't as good. Metallurgy had naturally upgraded to uncommon through use. It hadn't really felt like an upgrade at the time and was a rather lackluster event over my years of smithing. As more metal came out of the dungeon, and various metals and alloys were distributed, my knowledge of the metals grew and my skill upgraded. My forging proficiency was still stuck at apprentice, sadly, but I could feel that it was on the cusp of journeyman. Warding was in the same boat, as I felt it nearing the edge of rare as I laid down more of the formation. Mana Engraving was already at rare from all the use and had only minimally gone any further. The jump from rare to epic was a large one, and I hadn't even done it with any of my class skills yet. Mana Infusion was my only skill stuck at common for my profession, and I wasn't in a hurry to increase it. It would help create better gear, but not many needed my affinity for equipment, making the gains I could get from a higher rarity infusion skill minimal. Basic Runecrafting was at rare still, but that was in the same boat as Runesmithing. Both applied a bonus to any runes I created, but they did different things. Basic Runecrafting helped me gain knowledge about the runes, making them easier to read, while runesmithing helped in implementing that knowledge. They had grown by leaps and bounds with my constant study of formations and wards, even if they didn't receive an upgrade to show it. I felt the difference every time I worked. Honestly, my next skill choice was up in the air. I had everything I needed to carry out my craft. Now it was a choice of where to venture further. There were blacksmithing skills I could pick up that would help in that department, more engraving skills I could pick up that would make the process smoother and easier, more specialized ward or formation skills, which would make my ability with those specific subjects of enchanting greater. It was kind of a shock to go from only 6 skills to choose from for my class, to the multitudes available for my profession. Some of Vinny's skills were even on my list, or their base versions, as he had long since upgraded most of them. As odd as it seemed, the skill that had given me the most insight into what I was trying to do was Formation's Mana Flow. While warding helped me understand the process and pointed me in the right direction sometimes, seeing the mana flow or feeling it was a much greater boon. It was the main reason I had gotten so much done at the pace I had kept. Using it granted me the knowledge that I lacked and let me see where my mistakes were. That knowledge was then used to understand why. The why behind how things worked had eluded me for so long, and seeing the mana flow and change was beginning to let me see the deeper reasoning behind how runes worked. That being said, while taking a skill to make enchanting or smithing easier would be useful, it was the underlying knowledge I wanted access to, and only a few skills could be useful in that regard. Beginner runic language, rare, helps decipher and understand the language behind Tier 1 runes. Must have at least some prerequisite knowledge on the subject to be useful. Deeper study and familiarity with runes will allow you to get more from this skill. It was a new addition to my skill list and beat out the others by a mile when it came to usefulness. I knew, from extensive experience, that no skill imputed knowledge directly into your head. Not even basic runecrafting just gave me the knowledge. It hinted and nudged, but it was up to me to either see and heed the advice and understand it, or continue aimlessly. How this skill would work, I wasn't sure, but I had a few ideas. My guess was that it would help point out areas of runes I had seen before and help me understand how what I already knew was being used differently in other runes. My assumption came from the fact it said that prerequisite knowledge was required. With the decision made, I added the skill to my growing list and turned to the next order of business. I had a few new toys to try out, and one called to me much louder than all the others. And to use it, I needed my hammer. The first time I had summoned my hammer, it had been something. It had drained me of everything I had to bring the hammer into reality, and my suspicion was it would do the same now. Having grown by a great deal since the last time I had summoned it, I was excited to see if there would be any difference. The extra energy I would use to create it had to do something, right? That being said, I sat in the coldest area I could and readied myself for the dreadful pulling that would come. My forge was emptied of anything near where I sat to not cause a disturbance, and I was even a distance away from my spirit fire for the same reason. The pale blue flames had died down since it wasn't being fed, but still flickered back and forth. Activating the skill was exactly the same as last time. The mana it took started out as a small trickle before quickly increasing in intensity. The slim thread of mana flowing out grew into a string, then a cord, then more. Physical energy went next, the stamina being ripped out of me. I could clamp down on my energy and stop the process if I wanted, but that would create a weak weapon, and there was no need to fear my energy leaving. A fog of frost built up in front of me as the energy pouring out of me coalesced and gathered. Mental energy joined in next, taking from the pool that would usually power my laws. Instead of restraining its pull from including my newly acquired wind law, I let it take from both. I wasn't sure how the wind law would change things, but I felt no harm in letting it. Last, but certainly not least, it began to pull on my spirit. The energy that I used to empower things and the pool of it that had grown from my liberal use. The skill pulled on everything I had, and I gave to it freely. I wanted to create the best weapon I could, and holding back would only harm that ideal. It took longer than last time, as I had a lot more energy for the skill to siphon, but it wasn't a bad thing. The skill was already unusable in combat on the account it drained me dry of everything I had, and taking longer to form wasn't that much of a downside. It was easy enough to feel the power grow as more of it leaked out of me and joined the growing fog. Snow fell from it as the temperature plummeted. Almost an hour later, a comfortable weight fell into my awaiting hand and I couldn't keep the grin from my face. My hammer was back. It was silly to think of it as a sentient thing, but I had grown fond of it while swinging it around for nearly 2 years. My eyes immediately took in the differences. The glow it gave off was more vibrant and the frosty aura was stronger. The icy blues and whites were more vibrant, more lively if that could be a thing. Most wouldn't consider anything aligned with winter to be lively, but I felt like that was a misconception. Winter might not be the time for life to flourish, but that didn't mean that it was devoid of it. Especially now that there were magic plants and the advanced adaptation of animals that lived in the cold. Other than the colors becoming deeper and more colorful, the size and shape hadn't changed, thankfully. I was already familiar with the weapon the way it was, and if it had changed I would have had to change the way I fought, refamiliarizing myself with it. The one thing that did change about its function was its weight. It was much heavier now than it had been, and that was a much desired change. My strength had grown tremendously since I last used the skill, and it was nice to feel the heft it once had again. With Avalanche, Fury, and Glacial Presence, all boosting my strength further, not to mention my bloodline, it was near becoming too light. That wasn't the case anymore. It would be difficult to swing with one hand and would basically ruin all my training in doing such a thing, but that was a worthy trade-off. A hammer was supposed to be heavy and I would tolerate no less. The last change of note was the head of the weapon looked even more mesmerizing. Where it once looked like a living blizzard of snow revolving around inside the weapon, it was even more profound now. It almost looked like its own world was contained inside the ice. I did not doubt that the heat it sapped on contact had similarly grown as well. Changes noted and observed, my excitement would tolerate no more delay. Frozen Rift was calling and I would oblige. I was barely able to hold back and allow time for my mana slowly come back. As soon as I felt I had the bare minimum to activate the skill, I was off. Unsure of how the skill would function, I did take a tiny sojourn to find a more appropriate area to test the skill. Not a delay per se, but a temporary stay. Odd looks were shot my way as my face barely contained the excitement I felt. I didn't let those stop me though, and I exited the castle and walked to the edge of the cliff where the land was free. There would eventually be a building here, as there were already stakes placed out for such a thing, but I couldn't remember what it was, nor did I particularly care right now. Taking position near the edge of the cliff, I readied myself. I aimed to have whatever the skill did activate away from the budding city and directed its activation outward, over the land below. With everything set, I sent mana into the skill. My guesses were proven correct, and as mana flowed into my hammer, a different string of runes came alight than Shattering Hammer, and even more mana than was required than the latter skill. I had expected its hefty cost and prepared accordingly, sending mana in droves into my weapon. The power flowed through the runes and reached the head after winding through the glowing lines along the shaft. Sensing that it would soon finish, I began my swing and observed with wide eyes. The mana vanished, gone without a trace, and in its place was something else. Something that set my instincts on edge. In barely a split second, what was once a swinging hammer with massive amounts of mana became something more. From the leading flat face of my swing, my hammer hit the air and stopped dead. Ripples of power flowed out from where my weapon had stopped, and it felt like I had hit an unmovable wall. No matter how hard I pushed, my hammer was stuck. Before I could question what was happening, a dreadful cold flowed from the hammer's face and ice shot out in a line. A giant pillar of ice longer than I was tall extruded out of the weapon faster than I could blink before the connection was cut off. Its power was spent, and in place of what had once been a sizable portion of my regenerated mana, was a shining pillar of ice. If that was all, it would have been underwhelming. Even I could form ice like the skill had. Not nearly as fast or forceful as what I had just witnessed, but I could do it. What set me on edge was the feeling in my bones that caused my fear to build. Even looking at it made my feet want to back away involuntarily. The ice the skill formed scared me. Contained a cold that I wasn't sure even I would be able to endure. Even with fear bubbling up, I couldn't tear my eyes away. Even as it felt like they were freezing over and the need to blink became painful, I couldn't. This was what I was chasing. An ice so cold and enduring that it could freeze anything. Chapter 210 Skill Testing. The pillar of ice slowly dissipated, breaking apart and transforming back into ice mana as I stood and marveled at it from the same spot I launched it at. It took a few moments for the pillar to fall apart after not being fed mana, which wasn't surprising. Actually, it was a wonder it lasted so long without active intervention. Usually my ice flaked apart soon after being deprived of mana to keep its structural integrity. Even after the last flex transformed back into ice mana, the purest ice mana I had ever felt, the feeling it had given off was still in my mind. There was something about it that called to me. That much was obvious, but I hadn't expected the ice to be so strong. It was on an entirely different level than what I could create. The fact I had so much farther to go filled me with joy rather than envy. I hadn't felt myself truly progress many times lately, and this was a wide-open door to doing just that. It wouldn't be quick, but it was at least an avenue that wasn't shrouded in mystery. So much of what we did to get stronger was guesswork, and assuming how things worked that it was nice to finally have something as reference to point at and study. Speaking of doors I could use to progress, there was one big one that I planned to take in the coming months. Of the rewards I received, only one had lasted this long without being used. The Stars of Primordial Frost Mana Cultivation Technique. A mouthful, but something that promised another power bump. I had read through it quite a few times to internalize everything that it said, but I wasn't able to use it yet. It needed massive amounts of ice mana at a purity I couldn't make, even with my new skill. It was something I had only ever felt once, and even then, it was only the barest hint of what I needed. There were ways to practice the technique without the massive amounts of pure ice mana, but it led to subpar results and I deemed it not worth the effort. It would take a large amount of work to just do that, and it wasn't even the best use of the technique. No, if I was going to do it, I was going to do it right. That being said, the one time I had felt anywhere near the required mana was during winter. We were far enough north that the purity of the ice mana during winter was truly something, but even then, it hadn't been enough. If I wanted to go through with it, I'd have to go further north and not by a short amount. My senses were greatest toward mana of my own affinity, but even with diminished senses toward other affinities, I had never felt any other type reach the purity that ice had during winter. The nature mana of the area we passed through in Wisconsin was up there in purity, but nothing else came close. There were spots on the map that promised that amount of purity, but we hadn't encountered any of them. The bad thing about it was I had to wait. By the time I was ready to break open the technique and see what needed to be done, winter was already waning. It took many months to even reach this far north, and when we finally did, I couldn't just run off and do it either. There was probably somewhere that would work in summer, but that was out of my range to get to. Not to mention the fact it was probably filled with beasts trying to stay within the pure Arctic zone. Now, with my plans specifically made around leaving the winter months open, nothing was holding me back from doing it. The only thing I had to do was wait, and the waiting was brutal. Once again settling my racing mind over what would happen in the future, I turned back to my new skill. The first use of it was enlightening, but I needed to explore the range that I could use it in and see where I could incorporate it into my fighting style. I had to wait for my mana to come back after every use, but that gave me time to think of different things I could do with the skill. For its second activation, I did everything the same to see if the skill would act the same way. It was the first test to make sure the skill wasn't willful. None of my skills had been like that, but some in the city had skills that did. Usually, it was with people who had odd affinities, but it was a basic enough test to rule out that possibility. The last thing I wanted was to be in a tough fight and think my skill would do one thing but instead do something else. Everything activated the same, and the same dreadful pillar of cold sprang into existence. The third time, I flipped my hammer around and used the spiked end for its activation. I used both sides of my hammer while fighting and needed to make sure the skill could be used with both. Mana flowed through the same channels, and the same activation sequence caused ice to spring from the hammerhead. Except this time, instead of a blunt pillar of ice, it was a giant spike. It retained the sharp point the form of my hammer had and looked even more deadly than when I had the hammer flipped. Instantly upon seeing it, I could think of a multitude of uses for the skill. After using a hammer for so long, the uses of the different sides were ingrained in me. Flipping from one to the other was muscle memory by now and took only a flick of the wrist to occur. Being journeyman level in heavy weapon mastery wasn't just for show. It would take some practice, but I would eventually reach the same muscle memory with my new skill as well. With both sides of the hammer used, I explored other uses for the skill. Hitting rocks, the ground, trees, anything I could think of. Rocks couldn't hold up to the force the skill provided, even when I stopped my hammer before impact. The ice it conjured was enough to pulverize the surrounding boulders I used as practice dummies. The same happened to the trees, as they were blasted apart. It was the ground that was different. The skill didn't send a pillar of ice into the ground like a missile. It didn't really do anything to the ground. When the mana was pulled away, and what I assumed was that connect with another plane part of the skill activated, spikes exploded out of the ground in front of me. Which was odd because I was using the flat, blunt side of the hammer. Numerous, waist-high spikes exploded out of the ground ranging 10 feet ahead of where I hit the ground with my hammer before the skill petered out. It extended the same length that the pillars usually were, but except for one giant pillar, it was numerous little ones launched from the ground upward. Seeing an entirely new use, another round of testing and exploration ensued. I quickly found out that intent played a major role in what I was trying to accomplish. I hadn't been trying to do anything with the skill, letting it activate on its own, which was a mistake. I found that out when I tried to send a pillar into the earth like I expected to happen before. That resulted in getting showered in dirt as what I expected to happen happened. That made me wonder why spikes were formed the first time instead, which led to envisioning what I wanted to happen. Honestly, I should have expected what I found out, but I told myself I was following the natural testing process. When I envisioned a spike, the skill formed a spike. When I envisioned a pillar formed. Even when I pushed the boundaries and thought of the carpet of spikes while swinging at air caused it to occur. By then, with the hours spent testing and waiting for my mana to come back, night had fallen and Ashley had come to find me. I had lost track of time and was having such a wonderful time I had completely lost track of what I had planned for the day. She wasn't happy about having to find me, but it was only a slight irritation. With my fun dashed, I let myself get pulled away. The sooner I let it happen, the sooner I could get back to it. Austin. Point of view. Is your friend coming? Marcus asked, drawing his attention away from the piece of paper in front of him. Yes. No. It's complicated. Austin stammered, still trying to understand what it was he just read. It wasn't the length of the letter that made it difficult, it was the content. He had known that they had confronted the demons, and he had supreme confidence that they would be able to win, especially with the help of another pylon. He was glad to know that all of his family had survived and most had even grown. But what confused him was the state Chris was said to be in. He knew that a fight with demons would be tough, but the injuries described to him seemed unreal. He knew how strong and tough he was, which made how wounded he was a surprise. Austin wasn't sure when he started thinking of his friend as invincible, but with every fight he walked away from, that feeling grew. It didn't help that every fight he walked away from made him stronger too. His anchor made sure of that. It was known that accomplishing feats in line with or related to your anchor strengthened your spirit. It was one of the only known ways to grow in power spiritually. Not only was that path the hardest and had the least amount of people on it, but it also had the least known methods to progress along it. The knowledge surrounding it being coveted and hidden didn't help. With every fight he won, or was left standing, his spirit would grow in response. The same way that every time Jonathan stood in front and defended all those behind him, he would grow. Getting that boost, along with the essence from what he killed, made him grow at a pace Austin couldn't keep up with. He could keep up in levels, sure, but that wasn't a direct correlation to power. What do you mean it's complicated? Is he coming or not? Marcus asked, frustrated at his taciturn answer. That brought Austin's mind away from his crumbling expectations of his friend. Well, he is not, but others are, he said, smirking as he saw Marcus's unwelcome scowl at his vagueness. What do you know of demons? Austin asked, abruptly changing the subject. Marcus knew better than to question the man and went along shrugging. The basics, I guess. They weren't involved in my tutorial, but I've heard about them form others. Then you know how out of hand they can get? Austin gestured. Marcus nodded. Well, that's what he's been dealing with up north. They just got done killing them all, which was why they couldn't come in the first place. Austin said, Now that's over with. I asked him to come down, but he said no. Marcus' face showed a range of emotions at hearing there were demons on the earth, but Austin waved them away. There's no need to worry. They were taken care of. How can you be sure? If even one dash, Marcus rushed to say but was cut off. I'm sure, Austin said firmly. It would be good to keep a lookout for any more, but the ones that were here are gone. You can be sure of that. How many did he have to kill to get that injured? I've seen him face down hundreds and come out with less than a scratch. You've shown yourself worthy of trust, and I still take your word on this. Marcus ground out. Worries abated, Marcus focused back on the important part. Chris wasn't coming. He grunted. If it's about price, we can negotiate dash. Austin waved him off. It's not about price. Chris isn't like that. Honestly, he might come for the fight alone. The crazy bastard. He muttered the last bit. He didn't come away from the fight unscathed, and it's taking him longer to recover than I thought it would, he stated. Otherwise, I would go up there and drag him down here myself. Marcus nodded, taking in the new information before responding. But there are people coming? Austin nearly sighed. Yes, there are. Just not the people I wanted. Marcus either didn't catch his dejected tone or didn't care, because he started reviewing their plans and started coming up with new ones. How strong are the ones coming? And how many? Marcus began questioning. Austin began laying out what he knew and dredged up with the last remembered of their strength before he left. He knew they had grown since then, but an estimate was better than nothing. Even while describing what he knew, Austin kept thinking about the last paragraph. Austin, I hope you are well. I'm sorry, but I won't be able to come. My arm will take time to regrow, and I do not want to leave the healers while it does. Additionally, there is much I must do here, which hinders my ability to leave. You know my plans for winter, and with it fast approaching, I cannot leave now. In my stead, others wish to join you, and I've sent them with supplies that should help you. Mitchell is curious as to whether these infernal creatures will hold up to his poison. He was rather upset that it didn't work on the demons. He and your brother have been cooking up some terrifying things. It went on to other details, but it ended with this. Oh, I nearly forgot. Among the forces marching south to join you, Aunt Carrie is at its head. Your mother misses you and should be able to see her little boy soon. She was quite adamant about being a part of the group. She's grown quite a lot and may even be a match for you if you've been slacking. She gained a law and went through the first stage of body refining. Unlike someone else I know. You baby. Regards. Your icy bastion that shields you from harm, or whatever nonsense you addressed me as. His mother was coming. Of course, Chris saved that bit for last, the bastard. End of chapter 210.